Welcome to Champion Stories. If this is your first time here, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And now, onto today's story. The morning sun filtered through the windows of the Wildcard Boxing Gym in General Santos City, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors that had witnessed countless hours of Manny Pacquiao's legendary training sessions. But today was different. Today, for the first time in his illustrious career, the 8-division world champion would not be training alone or with his usual sparring partners. Today, his eldest son, Jimuel, would step into the ring alongside him. Manny arrived earlier than usual, his hands trembling slightly as he wrapped them with the familiar white tape he had used thousands of times before. The nervous energy coursing through his body surprised him. He had faced the most feared fighters in the world, performed in front of millions, yet the prospect of training with his 17-year-old son filled him with an anxiety he had never experienced in any championship bout. Jimuel entered the gym wearing simple black shorts and a white tank top, his youthful frame carrying the unmistakable genetic gifts of his father: quick feet, sharp eyes, and an instinctive understanding of distance and timing. The young man had been asking for this opportunity for months, and Manny had finally agreed, though not without reservations that kept him awake the previous night. The gym felt unusually quiet, despite the presence of other trainers and boxers going about their morning routines. Freddie Roach, Manny's longtime trainer, observed from the corner with knowing eyes, understanding the profound significance of this moment. The Filipino boxing legend was about to pass down more than just technical knowledge. He was sharing a piece of his soul. Manny began with basic footwork drills, watching intently as Jimuel mirrored his movements. The boy's natural athleticism was evident, but what struck the father most was the determination etched across his son's face. It was the same expression Manny had worn as a hungry teenager in this very gym, dreaming of escaping poverty through the sport that would eventually make him a global icon. As they moved through shadowboxing sequences, Manny found himself transported back to his own beginnings. He remembered the calloused hands of his first trainer, the empty stomach that drove him to train harder, the dreams that seemed impossible from the streets of Kibawe. Now, watching his son throw combinations with increasing confidence, those memories felt both distant and immediate. The heavy bag work revealed Jimuel's raw power, each punch landing with a satisfying thud that echoed through the gym. Manny positioned himself behind the bag, holding it steady while offering gentle corrections to his son's technique. The physical contact through the leather brought an unexpected wave of emotion. This was the closest they had been in years, connected not just as father and son, but as two fighters sharing the most intimate language Manny knew. Other gym members began to take notice, forming a loose circle around the ring as word spread that the great Pacquiao was training with his son. The attention didn't seem to affect Jimuel, who remained focused on absorbing every instruction, every demonstration his father provided. The session intensified as they moved to pad work, Manny holding the mitts while Jimuel threw combinations. The rhythm they developed felt natural, almost telepathic, as if 18 years of shared DNA had created an unspoken understanding of timing and movement. Sweat began to pour from both their faces, mixing determination with the humid Philippine air. As the training session neared its end, Manny realized this was more than just a father teaching his son to box. This was a bridge being built across generational gaps, cultural shifts, and the natural distance that success and fame had created between them over the years. The sparring session began with light contact, both father and son wearing headgear and 16-ounce gloves that felt foreign on Jimuel's hands. Manny moved with the fluid grace that had made him legendary, but he held back considerably, allowing his son to find his rhythm without the overwhelming pressure of facing a Hall of Fame opponent at full intensity. Jimuel's breathing grew heavier as the rounds progressed, but his eyes remained sharp and focused. Manny could see glimpses of his own fighting spirit emerging in his son's movements, the way Jimuel slipped punches with subtle head movement, the manner in which he stepped to the side after throwing combinations, the instinctive way he kept his chin tucked and hands high. The gym had grown quieter as other fighters paused their own training to witness this historic moment. Even the veteran trainers, men who had seen every conceivable scenario in professional boxing, found themselves captivated by the intimate display of legacy being passed from father to son. Angelo, one of the longtime gym assistants, stood motionless near the heavy bags, his weathered hands gripping a towel as he watched the Pacquiao bloodline continue its boxing journey. As they moved through the third round of light sparring, Manny began to increase the pace slightly, testing his son's defensive capabilities and cardiovascular conditioning. Jimuel responded admirably, his footwork becoming more confident with each exchange. The young man's left hook showed particular promise, crisp, compact, and delivered with the kind of natural timing that couldn't be taught. Between rounds, as they touched gloves and circled each other, Manny noticed something profound happening within himself. The competitive fire that had driven him through 62 professional fights was being tempered by an entirely different emotion, paternal pride mixed with protective instinct. He wanted to push Jimuel to excellence while simultaneously shielding him from the brutal realities of professional boxing. The conditioning portion of their training session revealed the generational differences between them. While Manny attacked each exercise with the mechanical precision of someone who had performed these movements countless times, Jimuel approached them with the enthusiasm and slight awkwardness of youth, discovering his physical limits for the first time. Sit-ups, push-ups, and rope climbing became a shared meditation, their synchronized breathing creating a rhythm that seemed to sync their heartbeats. Manny found himself adjusting his pace to match his son's, something he had never done with any training partner throughout his professional career. The modification felt natural rather than accommodating, as if his body instinctively knew that this session served a purpose beyond mere physical preparation. Ligaya, an elderly woman who cleaned the gym in the early morning hours, paused her sweeping to observe the pair working through their routine. She had been present for many of Manny's legendary training camps, had witnessed him prepare for fights against De La Hoya, Mayweather, and Margarito. But this session carried a different energy entirely. The desperation and hunger that had always driven Manny's training was replaced by something more complex, a desire to share rather than simply achieve. As they moved to the speed bag, Jimuel struggled initially with the rhythm and timing required to maintain consistent contact. Manny positioned himself behind his son, placing his hands gently on Jimuel's shoulders to demonstrate the proper stance and body positioning. The physical guidance created an unexpected moment of vulnerability for both of them, a rare instance of intimate connection in a relationship that had been largely defined by Manny's frequent absences due to training camps and promotional obligations. The speed bag finally began to respond to Jimuel's strikes, creating the distinctive rapid-fire sound that had been the soundtrack to Manny's rise from poverty to global stardom. Each successful sequence brought a smile to Jimuel's face, and Manny found himself grinning as well, remembering his own first experiences with this particular training tool decades earlier. The afternoon heat began to intensify within the confines of the gym, creating a humid atmosphere that made every breath feel thick and heavy. Sweat dripped steadily from both father and son as they transitioned to the double-end bag, a piece of equipment that demanded precise timing and hand-eye coordination. Jimuel approached it with the same determination he had shown throughout the session, but Manny could sense a slight fatigue beginning to set in. This was the moment Manny had been dreading and anticipating simultaneously. Physical exhaustion had always been the great revealer in boxing. It stripped away pretense, exposed character, and determined who possessed the mental fortitude to continue when their body begged them to stop. He watched carefully as Jimuel's combinations became slightly less crisp, his footwork marginally heavier, but the young man's resolve remained unshaken. Memories flooded back to Manny as he observed his son's struggle with fatigue. He remembered his own teenage years, training in makeshift gyms with equipment held together by duct tape and determination. The hunger that had driven him then was born from necessity. Boxing wasn't just a sport or a hobby, it was literally a matter of survival. For Jimuel, the motivation was different, more complex, rooted in legacy rather than desperation. The contrast wasn't lost on Manny as he considered how different their circumstances were. When he was Jimuel's age, he was already turning professional, fighting for purses that barely covered his family's basic needs. His son, by comparison, had grown up in luxury, attending private schools, traveling the world, and experiencing opportunities that would have seemed like impossible fantasies to the young Manny Pacquiao. Yet here was Jimuel, choosing to pursue the same brutal and demanding path that had elevated their family from poverty to prominence. The irony struck Manny deeply. His success had given his children the freedom to choose any direction in life, and his eldest son was voluntarily selecting the most difficult one possible. Benito, an aging trainer who had worked with champions across multiple decades, approached the ring area and began setting up for the final portion of their session, technique refinement on the mitts. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as he prepared the equipment, but his eyes remained fixed on the interaction between father and son, recognizing the historical significance of what he was witnessing. As they began the mitt work, Manny held the pads with the same intensity he brought to preparing for world championship fights. Each punch Jimuel threw was met with precise positioning and appropriate resistance, creating the kind of feedback that could only come from decades of experience. The sound of leather meeting leather echoed through the gym with increasing frequency and power. Jimuel's combinations began to flow more naturally as muscle memory started to develop. His jab became snappier, his cross more authoritative, and his hooks found their proper arc and timing. Manny adjusted the positioning of the mitts to challenge different angles and defensive responses, gradually increasing the complexity of the sequences he was calling for. The rhythm they established transcended the typical trainer-fighter dynamic. This was generational knowledge being transmitted through physical contact, cultural heritage expressed through the language of boxing, and paternal love channeled through the demanding pursuit of excellence. Every correction Manny made carried the weight of his entire career. Every encouragement held the depth of his hopes for his son's future. Other gym members had quietly gathered at a respectful distance, forming an impromptu audience for this unprecedented display. Even the most experienced fighters among them recognized they were witnessing something extraordinary, not just a training session, but the continuation of a boxing dynasty in its most intimate and authentic form. The intensity of their work together seemed to create a bubble of concentration that insulated them from external distractions. Neither father nor son appeared aware of the growing crowd of observers, both completely absorbed in the immediate demands of the training and the deeper connection it was fostering between them. The final rounds of mitt work pushed both father and son to their physical limits. Jimuel's shirt was completely soaked through, clinging to his lean frame as he continued to throw combinations with diminishing speed but unwavering determination. Manny felt his own shoulders beginning to ache from holding the heavy mitts, but he maintained perfect positioning, ensuring that each of his son's punches landed with optimal impact and feedback. As the session progressed, Manny began to notice subtle details that reminded him powerfully of his own fighting style. The way Jimuel's left shoulder dipped slightly before throwing his signature left hook was identical to Manny's own tell from his early professional years. The manner in which his son shifted his weight from his back foot to his front foot during combinations mirrored the footwork patterns that had made Manny famous throughout his career. These genetic echoes of technique fascinated and concerned Manny simultaneously. While he felt pride in seeing his own natural abilities reflected in his son, he also understood the immense pressure that would inevitably accompany any serious boxing pursuit. The Pacquiao name carried expectations that could either elevate or crush a young fighter's aspirations. Teodoro, one of the gym's most respected cornermen, had positioned himself near the ring apron to observe the technical aspects of their training. His trained eye caught nuances that casual observers might miss. The natural timing in Jimuel's defensive movements, the instinctive way he created angles after throwing combinations, the subtle head movement that suggested an innate understanding of boxing's defensive requirements. The conditioning segment that followed the mitt work revealed the true depth of Jimuel's commitment to the training session. Despite obvious fatigue, he attacked each exercise with the same intensity he had shown at the beginning of their workout. Burpees, mountain climbers, and jumping jacks became tests of character rather than mere physical challenges. Manny found himself studying his son's face during these moments of extreme exertion, searching for signs of the mental toughness that separated professional fighters from recreational athletes. What he saw both impressed and worried him. Jimuel possessed the stubborn determination necessary for boxing success, but he also displayed a vulnerability that came from never having experienced true adversity. The contrast between their backgrounds became most apparent during the final stretching routine. Manny's body moved through the flexibility exercises with the mechanical precision of someone who had performed these movements thousands of times, each stretch serving a specific purpose in his recovery and injury prevention protocol. Jimuel followed along with enthusiasm, but lacked the deep understanding of why each movement mattered. As they worked through the cool-down period, Manny reflected on the broader implications of what had transpired during their training session. This wasn't simply a father teaching his son a sport. It was the potential beginning of a journey that could define Jim Newell's entire life trajectory. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than any championship belt Manny had ever carried. Esperanza, the gym's longtime receptionist, had been quietly documenting the session with her phone camera, understanding that this moment would likely become part of boxing history, regardless of whether Jim Newell pursued the sport professionally. Her discretion and respect for the family's privacy had earned her their trust over the years, and she captured images that focused on the emotional connection rather than exploiting the moment for publicity. The final minutes of their training session took on an almost ceremonial quality. Both father and son moved through their remaining exercises with a shared understanding that something significant had occurred between them. The physical training had been successful, but the emotional breakthrough felt even more important. Manny began to remove his hand wraps with the same methodical care he had used to apply them hours earlier. Each unwinding motion revealed hands that bore the accumulated damage of decades in professional boxing. Scarred knuckles, slightly crooked fingers, and calluses that told the story of countless training sessions and championship fights. Jim Newell watched his father's hands intently, perhaps for the first time truly understanding the physical price that boxing excellence demanded. The romanticized version of his father's career that he had grown up with was being replaced by a more complex and realistic understanding of what professional fighting actually entailed. The gym began to empty as other fighters completed their own training sessions, but father and son remained in their corner of the facility, neither quite ready to end this unprecedented shared experience. The silence that settled over their corner of the gym felt profound and meaningful, as both father and son sat on the ring apron, their legs dangling over the edge while they caught their breath. The intensity of their shared training session had created an intimacy between them that transcended their usual father-son dynamic, establishing a connection rooted in mutual respect and understanding. Manny studied his son's profile as Jim Newell stared across the gym, processing the physical and emotional demands he had just experienced. The young man's chest still rose and fell with the rhythm of recovery, but his expression had shifted from the eager anticipation he had shown at the beginning of their session to something more contemplative and mature. The realization struck Manny that this training session had served as more than just an introduction to boxing fundamentals. It had been Jim Newell's first real glimpse into the world that had defined his father's entire adult life. The glamorous public perception of championship boxing had been replaced by an authentic understanding of the discipline, sacrifice, and physical toll that excellence in the sport demanded. Jinky appeared in the gym's entrance, having arrived to pick up her husband and son as previously arranged. She remained at a respectful distance, recognizing the significance of the moment and understanding that her presence might interrupt something important happening between them. Her maternal instincts told her that both her husband and son had been changed by their shared experience. The afternoon light streaming through the gym's windows had shifted, casting longer shadows across the training area and signaling the approach of evening. The natural progression of time seemed to mirror the evolution of the relationship between father and son that had occurred during their hours together in the gym. Manny began to gather their training equipment with the same methodical approach he brought to all aspects of his boxing preparation. Each piece of gear was cleaned and stored properly, a ritual that demonstrated the respect and care he maintained for the tools of his trade. Jim Newell watched and learned, understanding that this attention to detail was part of what separated professional athletes from amateurs. The other gym members who had witnessed their training session maintained a respectful distance, but their admiration was evident in their expressions and body language. Renato, a young professional fighter who trained regularly at the facility, found himself inspired by what he had observed, recognizing that he had witnessed something that would likely become part of boxing folklore. As they prepared to leave the gym, Manny felt a complex mixture of emotions coursing through him. Pride in his son's performance and determination was balanced by concern about the potential dangers and disappointments that a boxing career could bring. The protective instincts of fatherhood conflicted with his understanding that growth often required exposure to risk and challenge. Jimuel's movements as he gathered his belongings showed a new awareness of his body and its capabilities. The training session had pushed him beyond his previous physical limits and revealed reserves of mental toughness he hadn't known he possessed. The confidence in his posture suggested that he had passed some internal test and proven something important to himself. The walk toward the gym's exit felt ceremonial, each step carrying the weight of tradition and legacy. Manny had entered the facility that morning as a father reluctantly agreeing to train with his son, but he was leaving as a mentor who had discovered unexpected depths in his student and himself. The humid Philippine air outside the gym felt refreshing after hours in the enclosed training environment. The familiar sounds of General Santos City, motorcycle engines, street vendors, and distant conversations provided a soundtrack for their transition back to the outside world. As they approached Jinky's waiting vehicle, both father and son carried themselves differently than they had that morning. The shared experience had created a bond that would influence their relationship for years to come, regardless of whether Jimuel chose to pursue boxing seriously or simply carried the lessons learned into other aspects of his life. The drive home through the familiar streets of General Santos City provided a quiet transition period for both father and son to process the intensity of their shared training experience. Jinky navigated the evening traffic with practiced ease, while occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror at her husband and son, both lost in their own thoughts about what had transpired in the gym. Jimuel stared out the window at the passing scenery, his mind replaying moments from their training session. The physical exhaustion he felt was unlike anything he had experienced before. Not the simple tiredness that came from recreational sports or fitness activities, but the deep, satisfying fatigue that resulted from pushing his body and mind to their absolute limits under expert guidance. Manny found himself studying his son's reflection in the car window, searching for signs of how the experience had affected him. The young man's posture suggested a new understanding of his own capabilities and limitations, a maturity that seemed to have developed over the course of their few hours together in the gym. The familiar landmarks of their neighborhood took on new significance as they approached their home. The comfortable suburban environment where Jimuel had grown up suddenly felt like a stark contrast to the raw, demanding world of the boxing gym. Manny wondered if his son was beginning to understand the journey that had taken their family from poverty to prosperity. As they pulled into their driveway, the modern house with its manicured lawn and security gates served as a tangible reminder of how far the Pacquiao family had traveled from Manny's humble beginnings. The success that had provided this lifestyle had come at the cost of countless hours in gyms, exactly like the one they had just left, pursuing excellence through repetition, discipline, and unwavering commitment. Inside the house, the familiar comfort of home provided a gentle contrast to the intensity of their training environment. Jimuel headed directly to his room, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose muscles were beginning to stiffen from unaccustomed exertion. The hot shower he took seemed to wash away more than just sweat. It marked a transition from the person he had been that morning to someone who now carried a deeper understanding of his father's world. Manny settled into his favorite chair in the living room, his body automatically assuming the recovery position he had perfected over decades of professional training. The familiar aches in his shoulders and hands reminded him that despite his retirement from active competition, his body still responded to intense physical activity with the same patterns it had developed over his legendary career. The evening routine of their household continued around them, but both father and son remained somewhat separate from the normal family dynamics, each processing their shared experience in their own way. The other children seemed to sense that something significant had occurred, but they respected the contemplative mood that had settled over Manny and Jimuel. As dinner time approached, the aroma of Jinky's cooking began to fill the house, providing the kind of nourishment that both men desperately needed after their demanding training session. The simple act of sharing a family meal would serve as a bridge between the intensity of their gym experience and the comfort of their domestic life. Manny reflected on how the day had exceeded his expectations in every possible way. He had entered the gym that morning with concerns about his son's readiness for the demands of serious boxing training, but Jimuel had demonstrated not only physical capability, but also the mental fortitude that separated dedicated athletes from casual participants. The realization that his son possessed genuine potential in the sport brought a complex mixture of emotions: Pride in Jimuel's natural abilities was tempered by knowledge of the sacrifices and dangers that a professional boxing career would inevitably entail. The protective instincts of fatherhood conflicted with his understanding that meaningful growth often required exposure to challenge and risk. As the sun set over General Santos City, casting long shadows through their living room windows, both father and son understood that their relationship had been fundamentally altered by their shared training experience. The foundation for something deeper and more meaningful had been established, regardless of whether Jimuel chose to pursue boxing seriously or simply carried the lessons learned into other aspects of his life. The quiet satisfaction that settled over their household that evening reflected the successful completion of something that had been years in the making, a genuine connection between father and son, forged through mutual respect, shared effort, and the timeless language of boxing that had defined the Pacquiao legacy for an entire generation. The following morning brought a different energy to the Pacquiao household. Jimuel woke with muscles he had never felt before, each movement serving as a reminder of the previous day's intense training session. The soreness was not unpleasant. Rather, it felt like a badge of honor, physical evidence of his initiation into his father's world of disciplined excellence. Manny rose early, as was his custom, but instead of heading directly to his morning routine, he found himself checking on his son. The paternal concern that had kept him awake for portions of the night was balanced by genuine curiosity about how Jimuel had processed their shared experience. The young man's commitment during training had impressed him, but the true test would be his attitude and determination in the days that followed. At breakfast, the family dynamic felt subtly different. Jimuel carried himself with a new confidence that was immediately apparent to his siblings. Michael, Princess, Queen Elizabeth, and Israel seemed to sense that their older brother had crossed some invisible threshold, though they couldn't quite articulate what had changed about him. Jinky observed her husband and eldest son with the intuitive understanding that only comes from years of marriage and motherhood. She recognized the signs of a significant shift in their relationship, the way they made eye contact, the respectful distance they maintained, and the unspoken communication that seemed to flow between them. Throughout the day, Manny found his thoughts returning repeatedly to specific moments from their training session. The image of Jimuel pushing through obvious fatigue to complete their final exercises had particularly impressed him. That kind of mental toughness couldn't be taught or faked. It was either present in someone's character or it wasn't. Jimuel spent much of the day researching boxing techniques and training methods online, his curiosity about the sport having been awakened by his first-hand experience. The videos he watched took on new meaning now that he had felt the physical demands of proper technique execution. What had once seemed like simple movements now revealed their complexity and precision requirements. The phone calls and text messages that Manny received throughout the day from gym members and boxing associates confirmed that word of their training session had spread through the local boxing community. The respectful tone of these communications suggested that their shared workout had been viewed as something significant rather than merely a casual father-son activity. As evening approached, both father and son found themselves unconsciously preparing for another potential training session. Manny gathered his gym bag with the same methodical care he had always shown, while Jimuel laid out workout clothes and began stretching his still sore muscles. The anticipation building between them was palpable, but unspoken. Neither wanted to pressure the other into making commitments about future training, yet both felt the magnetic pull of returning to the gym together. The foundation established during their first session seemed to demand continuation and development. The sunset over General Santos City painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, creating a backdrop that seemed to mirror the emotional intensity brewing within the Pacquiao household. Tomorrow would bring decisions about whether their shared boxing journey would continue or remain a single, perfect memory. The second training session came naturally, without formal discussion or elaborate planning. Father and son simply found themselves at the gym the following evening, their shared understanding making words unnecessary. This time, however, the atmosphere felt different, more relaxed yet somehow more profound, as if they had moved beyond the initial nervousness into something deeper and more meaningful. Jimuel's movements showed marked improvement from their first session together. The muscle memory was beginning to develop, and his combinations flowed with greater confidence and precision. Manny watched with growing amazement as his son demonstrated not just physical improvement, but an intuitive grasp of boxing's mental aspects that typically took months or years to develop. As they worked through their routine, other gym members gathered once again to observe, but this time, their presence felt more like a celebration than mere curiosity. The boxing community of General Santos City was witnessing the potential birth of another generation of Pacquiao excellence, and the significance wasn't lost on anyone present. The final portion of their training session focused on conditioning and flexibility work. As they moved through the exercises side by side, Manny felt an overwhelming surge of emotion that caught him completely off guard. This wasn't just about boxing technique or physical fitness. This was about legacy, family, and the continuation of something that had defined his entire life's purpose. When they finished their workout and began the familiar ritual of removing hand wraps and gathering equipment, Manny realized that the moment he had been unconsciously preparing for had arrived. The weight of everything he wanted to say to his son pressed against his chest, demanding expression after years of being held inside. As they sat together on the ring apron, both breathing heavily from their exertion, Manny looked directly into his son's eyes and saw not just his own genetic legacy, but the hopes and dreams of an entire family reflected back at him. The young man who had entered the gym as his son was leaving as something more, a potential torchbearer for everything the Pacquiao name represented. The words that came from Manny's heart were simple, but carried the weight of his entire career. Every championship, every struggle, and every moment of doubt he had ever experienced. He spoke about the responsibility that came with their family name, the importance of humility regardless of success, and the obligation to use any gifts they possessed in service of others who were still struggling. But more than anything, he expressed his pride in the man Jimule was becoming, not because of his boxing potential, but because of the character, determination, and heart he had displayed during their time together. The tears that began to flow down Manny's face were not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming gratitude for the opportunity to share his deepest passion with his eldest son. The emotional impact of his father's words hit Jimule with unexpected force. The realization that he had not only met, but exceeded his father's expectations filled him with a sense of purpose and responsibility that would guide him for the rest of his life, whether in boxing or any other pursuit he chose to follow. In that moment, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of the gym that had shaped his father's destiny, Jimule understood that he had received something far more valuable than boxing instruction. He had been given his father's complete trust, respect, and unconditional love. Thank you for watching another episode of Champion Stories. If you enjoyed today's story, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming inspiring tales about Manny Pacquiao. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and many times your ideas inspire our next episode. See you next time.